In the summer of 1943, a transport of French prisoners of war arrived at Camp Forest, Tennessee, expecting degradation. What they found instead was a calculated mercy that felt like betrayal. The American captors fed them adequately. The barracks had windows. The work was hard but logical. Farm labor, fence repair, nothing designed to break them. And then came the discovery. The latrines. Not trenches, not buckets, indoor plumbing, flush toilets, rolls of white paper stacked in neat dispensers. For men who had survived the collapse of France, the long retreat into Germany, the cattle cars, and 3 years of camps that measured rations in grams, this comfort arrived like an accusation. It was not cruelty that unmade a man. It was kindness with conditions. What followed was a reckoning none of them had prepared for. Not how to escape, but whether they should. Not how to maintain dignity under torture, but how to maintain it under consideration. The story that unfolded inside those barbed wire fences would teach them that the most dangerous prison is one that asks you to admit your captivity feels survivable. This is the story of Lieutenant Claude Mercier and the men under his watch, and how the smallest comforts revealed the largest truths about what war takes from those it does not kill. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The truck stopped at the gate just before dawn, and the prisoners could smell it before they saw it, not the stench of a military camp, but grass, open air, something almost clean. Claude Mercier stood among 43 other French soldiers, each one aged by 3 years of German captivity, each one thin enough that their uniforms hung like empty sacks. They had been processed at 3 other camps, one in Kentucky, one in Ohio, before being assigned here to this sprawling facility in Tennessee. The rumors had been steady. The Americans were different, more orderly, less willing to starve their prisoners, less interested in proof of suffering. Claude had learned not to believe rumors. The American sergeant, a heavy-set man with a Tennessee accent thick as molasses, began his speech with the tone of someone reading a manual. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will obey, you will not escape. Do so, and you will be shot. He paused. You will be treated fairly. That means you eat what we eat, minus the coffee. You sleep in the barracks. You work in the fields or at the quarry. You follow the rules. Nobody dies. Understood? A young German-speaking guard translated. The French soldiers understood long before the translation finished. Claude noticed the barracks first. Actual wooden structures with roofs, not canvas. Then the compound itself, organized in grids, water pumps at regular intervals, a small medical station with a red cross painted on the roof, an American flag hanging limp in the humid air. It was like entering a different war. That evening, as the sun collapsed into red and the temperature refused to drop, Claude was assigned to Barracks 7. The building was crowded, 32 men in a space designed for 20, but it was dry. There were cots with thin mattresses, a small stove for winter, windows. This is not real, whispered Jean-Luc, a sergeant from Marseille, sitting on the cot beside Claude's. This is a trick to make us docile. Once we stop expecting cruelty, they will use it. Claude said nothing. He had learned that hope and fear were the same hunger wearing different names. It was Corporal Dubois, however, who made the discovery that would fracture whatever fragile peace the camp had constructed. He had needed the latrine around midnight. Every prisoner knew that permission had to be requested, that there were limits to movement, that order was enforced through routine. So Dubois had waited until the guard change, then raised his hand to the night watch, a thin American boy who looked younger than 19. The boy had simply nodded and pointed. Dubois returned to the barracks 30 minutes later, his face the color of wet concrete. He did not speak. He lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling, breathing in the measured way of a man in shock. What happened? Claude whispered. It is American, Dubois said finally. The latrine, it is a room with porcelain and water that flushes. There is paper, white paper, in rolls, on a holder like a hotel. Jean-Luc laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cut the darkness. The man is delirious. 3 years in camps and his mind has broken. No, Dubois said quietly. I have touched it. The porcelain is cool. The paper is soft. It is real. Claude closed his eyes and understood in that moment that everything they had survived until now, the hunger, the forced marches, the cold that froze urine to their legs, everything had been preparation for something worse. Comfort. American comfort, the kind of comfort that asks a man to question whether his captivity might be bearable. By dawn, every prisoner in the barracks had visited the latrine. By noon, the knowledge had spread through the compound like fire through dry grass. The Americans, it seemed, had not come to break them. They had come to keep them alive, and no one knew which was more dangerous. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The work details began at 6 in the morning. Claude and 14 others were assigned to expand the quarry on the camp's eastern perimeter, breaking limestone, loading trucks, moving under the eye of a guard named Private Richardson, who had seen action at Kasserine Pass and carried the exhaustion of a man who no longer believed in victory. The work was heavy and mechanical. Claude's shoulders burned by mid-morning. His hands developed blisters, the first real physical damage he had sustained in months. There was a strange comfort in it. Pain meant he was still a soldier, still capable of something. At noon, they were given lunch, beef sandwiches, canned peaches, water. The beef was real, visible fibers in the meat. Claude had eaten so many potato soups that had no potatoes. He had stopped believing protein existed. Eat slow, Jean-Luc whispered, sitting beside him. Your stomach will betray you if you rush. They ate in silence. The American guards ate at a separate table, about 20 meters away. One of them was smoking a cigarette, an actual cigarette, not rolled paper and whatever dried leaves someone had managed to find. Claude watched the smoke rise and felt something in his chest fracture. That evening, the revelation deepened. A new prisoner had arrived in the infirmary, a Polish man transferred from a camp in Virginia, sick with dysentery. The American medic, a corporal named Williams, had begun treatment immediately. Antibiotics, clear fluids, bed rest, not isolation, not punishment for illness, treatment. The news moved through the barracks like intelligence from a foreign country. The Germans would have let him die, whispered Fournier, a captain from Lyon. They would have left him in the barracks to spread sickness and reduce the mouth count. The Americans need workers, Jean-Luc said, but his voice had lost its edge. This is not mercy, it is logistics. That night, Claude found himself standing in the latrine for the second time, and he understood why men were beginning to lose the war inside themselves. The toilet was porcelain, white, unmarked, immaculate. The seat was wood, worn smooth by use. And the paper. God, the paper. It was thin, but soft, designed for one purpose, replaced when empty, available without asking, for a man who had used the same cloth for weeks because there was nothing else, who had squatted over pits that reeked of disease and human desperation. This was not a latrine. It was a message. It was the message that America was winning not because of better soldiers or bigger guns, but because it could afford to treat prisoners like human beings and still defeat them. Claude sat on the toilet, not using it, just sitting, and felt something break inside him that 3 years of captivity had not broken. It was not his spirit. It was his ability to be angry. It was his capacity to believe that the enemy was evil. An American boy guarded him. An American company fed him. American plumbing was keeping him clean. And he was still a prisoner. When he returned to the barracks, Jean-Luc was awake. sitting on his cot, staring at nothing. "I understand now," Jean-Luc said quietly without turning. "This is how they win. Not with strength, with proof that they are not monsters, with toilet paper." Claude lay on his cot and did not sleep. Outside, the July heat pressed down on Tennessee like the weight of occupation, and inside the barracks, 42 Frenchmen began the slow, terrible realization that survival and defeat were not opposites. They were the same thing, arriving by different routes. Chapter 3. The Routine. 3 weeks into the compound routine, Claude understood the architecture of American captivity. It was built on small permissions and earned trust, the opposite of German camps, where everything was withheld until suffering was assured. Morning roll call at 6, work details assigned by skill and physical condition, lunch at noon, return to barracks at 5, dinner at 6, lights out at 9, free time in the afternoon on Sundays, a canteen where prisoners could buy tobacco, soap, and letters to send home. Letters home. Claude had written 4, to his sister in Marseille, to a cousin in Lyon. The Americans had censored them, obviously, but not harshly. They had simply removed any reference to camp locations or guard rotations. The rest, memories, questions about family, expressions of endurance, they had allowed. 2 letters had been returned, stamped, address unknown. The work itself was grimly purposeful. The quarry was being expanded to support the war effort, limestone for ammunition production, for concrete, for the machinery of American industrial war. Claude and the other prisoners were helping to build the weapons that would eventually be turned toward Germany. The irony was not lost on him. Neither was the small comfort of knowing that his labor mattered, that he was not just being kept alive to no purpose. The guards rotated every 4 days, which meant relationships never deepened. There was no camaraderie with the Americans, but there was no cruelty either. They were efficient, professional, and apparently indifferent to the philosophical tragedy of French prisoners working to defeat their mutual enemy. Private Richardson was the exception. He had begun stopping by the quarry in the late afternoons, watching the men work, sometimes speaking to them in careful, broken French. He had been a translator before the war, a college student in Paris in 1939, studying literature. "Why are you here?" Claude asked him one afternoon, speaking quietly so the other guards would not hear. Richardson smiled, a small, tired expression. "Because America needs soldiers. Because I learned French. Because the army told me to be here." He paused. "Does it matter?" "No," Claude admitted. "I suppose it does not." By the 4th week, the prisoners had begun to organize themselves. Jean-Luc and Fournier had created a system of night discussions in the barracks, rotating topics, intellectual exercise, a way to keep the mind sharp and the group cohesive. They discussed philosophy, literature, the nature of defeat, the definition of honor under occupation, and they discussed, inevitably, the comfort. One night, Fournier raised the question directly. If we escaped, we would likely be captured and returned. They would shoot us or send us back to worse camps. So we do not escape. But the question is, why do we not escape? The barracks fell silent. "Because it is reasonable here," Jean-Luc said finally. "Because we have seen what unreasonable is. Then we have been beaten," Fournier concluded, "not by cruelty but by consideration. They have imprisoned our will to resist by treating us as if resistance is unnecessary." Claude listened but did not speak. He was thinking about the letters home, the ones that were never answered, the ones that might never arrive. He was thinking about the toilet paper, about the beef, about the American boy in the guard tower who had simply nodded when Dubois asked to leave the barracks. He was thinking about what it meant to survive without fighting, to endure without hope, to accept a cage because the cage was comfortable. If this story feels real to you, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in their place? Chapter 4. The letter. In the 5th week, a letter arrived in the mail distribution. It was addressed to Jean-Luc Arnault, company sergeant of the 5th Infantry Regiment, captured at Lyon in 1940. Jean-Luc opened it during the afternoon rest period, and his face went absolutely white. The letter was from his wife. It was dated April 1943, 3 months prior. It began normally. She was well, his daughter was learning to read, his mother was alive. But the 3rd paragraph changed everything. The Germans have requisitioned the house. They say it is temporary, that we will be compensated after the war. They have taken the cellar for storage. I do not know what they keep there. No one is permitted to see. Your mother has said nothing. I'm afraid to tell you this, afraid it will break something in you that still needs to work. But silence is a lie, and I have already lied enough. The letter continued, but Jean-Luc stopped reading aloud. His hands began to shake. That night, Jean-Luc did something no prisoner at Camp Forest had done since arrival. He attempted to escape. He did not succeed, could not have succeeded really with the fence, the guards, the dogs. He was caught before he even reached the perimeter, tackled by a guard dog and held at gunpoint by Private Richardson, who looked sick with regret even as he was following orders. Jean-Luc was taken to the punishment barracks, solitary confinement for 3 days, reduced rations, forced labor in the hottest part of the quarry. It was not brutal by German standards, but it was punishment, and it broke something in the compound's careful equilibrium. For the first time since arrival, the prisoners understood. The Americans were not soft. They were strategic. They were willing to hurt when necessary. The comfort was not kindness. It was control. Claude visited Jean-Luc on the 3rd day, when he was released back to the general barracks. The man looked aged. 3 days of solitary, and the weight of his wife's confession had carved new lines into his face. "What will you do?" Claude asked quietly. "Wait," Jean-Luc said. "That is all a prisoner can do. Wait and hope that the war ends before everything I have sacrificed ceases to matter. I have been a prisoner for 3 years. I can be a prisoner for 3 more if it means seeing her face again." But the escape attempt had consequences beyond Jean-Luc's punishment. The American command tightened security. More guards were posted. The freedom to move within the barracks was restricted. Visitors were no longer permitted in the infirmary. The comfort began to show its teeth. That evening, Private Richardson came to the barracks and asked for Claude by name. There was protocol to this, procedures, and other guards were present, but Richardson's manner suggested something unofficial was happening. "Walk with me," Richardson said. "The commandant wants to discuss work assignments." They walked to the edge of the compound, toward the fence line where no one could hear their conversation clearly. "Jean-Luc received that letter for a reason," Richardson said quietly, speaking in French. "It was intercepted at the Camp Mail Processing Center. Someone, I do not know who, decided it should reach him anyway. It was a test." "A test of what?" Claude asked. "Of what prisoners will do when they remember they have lives beyond these fences, when they remember what they are fighting for, when they remember that captivity is not fate. It is a temporary condition." Claude understood then. The American command was not just warehousing prisoners, they were studying them. The comfort was not cruelty inverted. It was a laboratory for understanding how men break, how they survive, how they choose between safety and honor. "Why are you telling me this?" Claude asked. "Because Jean-Luc's letter has inspired others to ask for mail, to remember. And because the commandant believes you are capable of helping the men understand what it means to endure captivity without losing themselves." Richardson paused. "He believes you are a leader. He wants to know if you can lead men toward patience or only toward despair." Claude looked at Richardson, this American boy who had studied French literature, who spoke the language with the accent of Paris, who was asking a prisoner to become a tool of the American military machine. "Tell him I will try," Claude said finally, because he understood what Richardson did not yet know, that every man in that barracks already knew the answer. The letter had shown them what they needed to know. The war was not being decided at Camp Forest. It was being decided somewhere else, by other men, in other places. All they could do was survive it intact. All they could do was wait. Chapter 5. The news. The news arrived on the radio in early September, broadcast by the American Armed Forces Network. The invasion of Sicily had succeeded. American and British forces had captured the island. Sicily, an Italian possession, a gateway to Europe, had fallen. The prisoners heard it during evening assembly, read aloud by the camp commandant, as if they should celebrate this news, as if American victory meant French redemption. Some of the younger prisoners did celebrate, a small, bitter cheer that the guards quickly suppressed. But most of the men simply absorbed the information and continued with their routines. Sicily was thousands of miles away. Italy was not France. The end of the war, whenever it came, was not yet visible. What changed was something more subtle. The realization that the Allies were winning, that Germany was retreating, that the war had a trajectory now, and it pointed toward peace, or at least toward resolution. For prisoners, this meant something dangerous: hope. Within a week, 3 more escape attempts were recorded. One man actually made it beyond the fence before being caught in the dark. The Americans responded by shortening recreation hours, increasing work quotas, and implementing stricter rules about mail and communication. The comfort was incrementally withdrawn, not all at once, but piece by piece. It was a lesson delivered in methodology. Comfort is a privilege, not a right. Compliance is rewarded with ease. Resistance is punished with rigor. Claude watched this transformation and understood what the American command was doing. They were teaching the prisoners what every captive must eventually learn, that survival requires accepting the unacceptable, that dignity under captivity is a luxury only available to those who stop fighting. One evening, Fournier cornered Claude in the barracks. "I know what the commandant is doing," Fournier said quietly. "He is proving that every man has a price, not money, not comfort, but the threat of its loss, the knowledge that resistance will make conditions worse. That is how empires maintain control, not through permanent cruelty, but through the implicit promise that cruelty awaits the disobedient." "Yes," Claude agreed, "I know. And what will you do about it?" Fournier pressed. "Will you lead us toward acceptance, toward becoming the kind of prisoners the Americans need, docile, productive, incapable of resistance?" Claude met his eyes. "I will lead us toward survival. If that requires acceptance, then yes. If it requires patience, then yes. If it requires waiting for the war to end so we can reclaim ourselves, then yes. That is what I will do." Fournier nodded slowly. "Then you have already lost. The moment you chose survival over freedom, you became complicit in your own imprisonment." "Freedom is a luxury," Claude replied. "The moment we crossed into this compound, I understood that. I chose my life over the idea of it. If that is loss, then yes, I am lost. But I am alive." That night, the guards distributed new work assignments. Claude was transferred to the kitchen, a position of responsibility and trust that would take him away from the quarry. It was a reward, clearly. An acknowledgement from the American command that he was performing his role correctly, that he was helping to maintain order through the promise of continued comfort. It was also a test of whether he would accept the promotion, whether he would let themselves be elevated above the other prisoners, whether he would become the commandant's tool. Claude accepted the assignment, and in that acceptance he understood that he had made a choice that would haunt him long after the war ended. Not a choice between honor and survival, but a choice to stop believing that honor and survival were separate things. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. 2 weeks before Christmas 1943, when the news came that the Allies had taken Naples, a visitor arrived at Camp Forest. He was an officer from the International Red Cross, a thin man with spectacles and a notebook, authorized to inspect conditions and speak with prisoners. His name was Dr. Helmut Richter, and he was German-speaking, which meant he could communicate with anyone in the compound. The commandant was nervous about this inspection. The recent tightening of rules, the reduction in comfort, the increased work quotas, these might appear punitive to an outside observer. So the camp was prepared. Rules were temporarily relaxed. Extra food was served. Barracks were cleaned. The latrines were spotless. When Richter visited Barracks 7, he asked if any prisoners had complaints. The silence was absolute. "No complaints," Claude said finally, speaking for the group. "We are treated fairly. We are fed. The work is hard but reasonable. The guards are professional." Richter studied him. "Are you the senior officer here?" "I am an assistant. The commandant values my cooperation in maintaining order." "I see." Richter made a note. "And how long have you been in captivity?" 3 years, since 1940. "And in that time you have learned to accept imprisonment." It was not a question. Claude understood this immediately. The Red Cross inspector was not interested in hearing that prisoners were being treated well. He was looking for something else, for the weight of suffering, for the signs that men were breaking under the pressure of captivity, for evidence that humanity was being preserved despite the machinery of war. Instead, he found a man who had made peace with his cage. "I have learned to survive," Claude said. "Is that not what all prisoners must do?" Richter removed his spectacles and cleaned them, a deliberate gesture that suggested he was gathering his thoughts. "When I was in the Great War," Richter said slowly, "I was captured by the French. They kept me in a camp near Paris. The conditions were terrible, cold, hunger, disease, but I survived because I refused to accept that the camp was permanent. I believed every day that it would end, that I would be released, that the war could not last forever." He replaced his spectacles. "I see now that I was correct. The war did end. I was released. But many men in that camp did not survive. Many gave up, and I have spent 30 years wondering if their death was inevitable, or if I simply had more hope than they did." Claude did not respond. "I am asking you," Richter continued, "as one prisoner to one person who has lived through captivity, have you lost your hope, or have you transformed it into something else? Have you stopped believing that this cage is temporary?" It was the most dangerous question anyone at Camp Forest had ever asked him. "I have learned," Claude said carefully, "that hope and despair are both luxuries. What remains is duty. Duty to survive, duty to the men under my care, duty to endure until the war ends." "And then," Richter pressed, "when the war ends, when you are released, what will you do with the memory of this place, this clean, efficient camp, these Americans who feed you and provide toilet paper and ask only for your compliance?" "I will remember," Claude said, "that survival required compromise. And I will carry that knowledge for the rest of my life." Richter made another note, and Claude understood. This was testimony that would be reported, that somewhere in Geneva someone would know that the American camp was succeeding in transforming prisoners into something less than men and something more than animals, something in between. Something that could survive captivity but never truly live again. If this battle still echoes in your mind, hit like. It helps these untold memories stay alive. That evening, the commandant called Claude to his office privately. On the desk was a photograph, a civilian, a woman, a girl of about 8 years old. "This is your wife?" the commandant asked. "This is your daughter?" Claude nodded, though he did not remember sending such a photograph. The Americans must have found it, extracted it from his belongings. "The war will be over within a year," the commandant said quietly. "Possibly less. When it is, you and the men under your watch will be released. You will go home. You will see this woman and this daughter again. They will not know what you have become. They will not understand what this place required of you. But you will know. You will carry that knowledge forever." He slid the photograph across the desk. "That is the real war, Mercier. The war inside yourself. The war between the man you were and the man you have become. This camp did not create that war. It simply gave it a stage." Claude took the photograph and understood that the commandant was not cruel. He was simply a man who understood that captivity destroys men more thoroughly than violence ever could. Chapter 7. The Silence. On May 8, 1945, the war ended. Germany surrendered. The Allies had won. And at Camp Forest, the prisoners were informed that they would begin repatriation within months. The barracks erupted in celebration. Men wept, men embraced, men spoke about returning home, about freedom, about reclaiming their lives. Claude stood apart and said nothing. Jean-Luc, who had become close to Claude over the 2 years since his escape attempt, found him alone in the latrine, the same latrine where Claude had first understood what American captivity meant. "You are not celebrating," Jean-Luc observed. "I am thinking about what happens next," Claude replied. "We go home. We see our families. We begin again." "We go home," Claude corrected, "as men who accepted captivity without resistance, as men who allowed comfort to be our prison, as men who chose survival over freedom." He paused. "Do you know what toilet paper means to me now? It means I was willing to be kept alive if the cage was clean enough." Jean-Luc sat down on the edge of the toilet, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 2 years prior, but which now seemed appropriate. "There is a choice we do not speak about," Jean-Luc said quietly. "The choice between honor and breathing, between pride and tomorrow. Everyone who survives a war makes that choice. The only question is whether we admit it." "And will you?" Claude asked. "Will you admit it when you see your wife?" "I will tell her that I survived, that our daughter has a father, that I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for the toilet paper and the beef and the roof that did not leak, and I will live with the knowledge that I bought those things with my dignity." Claude nodded slowly. "But I will also remember," Jean-Luc continued, "that staying alive meant I could testify, that someone needed to survive this camp not as a hero, but as a witness. That is not dishonor, Claude. That is a different kind of duty." In July, Claude Mercier boarded a ship bound for France. The voyage took 2 weeks. He stood on the deck and watched the ocean and thought about toilet paper, about comfort, about the terrible mathematics of captivity, how a clean latrine and regular meals could transform a soldier into something that looked human but felt hollowed. He would see his wife again. His daughter had grown in his absence. He would not recognize her. His sister would embrace him and see that something had died in him, that captivity had not killed, but captivity had revealed. Years later, Claude would try to explain to those who asked about his time as a prisoner. He would describe the camp, the work, the guards, the food, but he would always come back to the same realization. The most dangerous prison is one that asks you to be grateful for your chains. The war had ended, victory had been achieved, but inside Camp Forest, a smaller and more private war continued. The war every survivor wages with themselves, the war between accepting what happened and refusing to accept what it meant, the war between memory and silence. Claude chose silence, not because he was broken, but because he understood that some truths about survival are too heavy for words. He went home, he lived, he never spoke about Camp Forest again, but he never forgot the toilet paper. Subscribe for more true human stories of courage, conscience, and the wars that never really end.